everyone, welcome back to our RBT training. So today we're going to start talking about behavior. Most specifically, we're going to talk about conducting functional behavioral assessments in order to better understand why a behavior is occurring, and then what do we do with that and its implications on how it informs a behavioral intervention plan that you, most likely as an RBT, will be implementing with that student. So I'm going to go through the basics and give you kind of some background knowledge about how it's conducted so you have a more comprehensive understanding of where that plan really comes from, okay? So at its most basic element, again, we're going to talk about behaviors and why we might see some of these negative behaviors occurring. Remember that behavior most often is a form of communication. When first designing treatment for an individual, it's important to consider that the child is trying to communicate something to us. They don't have the ability to communicate effectively or appropriately or functionally as you and I would know communication. So instead, they use a behavior to get what they want, okay? So our first goal when we come to a case, and it's a behavioral case, is to figure out exactly what behaviors are the biggest concern and what needs to be targeted in our intervention for a change, okay? This is done in a variety of ways. First, what we really take a peek at is what is going to be the most crucial behavior for the individuals that are around this client, as well as what's going to be most socially significant in changing to better the life of the client themselves, okay? So when we start a conversation, usually it's with staff at school or parents within the home environment. We do a basic interview, or we might even use some sort of question format to help aid in our interview process. But this is really to identify the most socially significant behavior for change. What's going to have the biggest impact in a positive way for this individual we're working with, as well as the people that surround them. Okay, so we're going to ask ourselves questions like, does the child's behavior significantly different from that of their peers? All right, does the behavior lessen the possibility for successful learning, whether it's in the classroom environment or at home? Have past efforts to address the behavior using standard interventions been unsuccessful? Because if so, maybe we just have to take it as this is going to be a part of this person's repertoire. For example, maybe like swearing or something like that. And it's something that we're just going to have to train people to ignore because it's something that we've tried over and over and over again to decrease and procedures haven't worked. So why exhaust our efforts on something that's just going to consume more time and instead concentrate in other areas that are more important? Does the behavior represent a skill or performance deficit rather than a maybe cultural difference? Is the behavior serious? Is it persistent? Is it chronic? Or is it even a threat to the child or others? Because if it is, then that might actually be one of those pivotal things that says, oh, you know what? We really need to target this behavior first, right? Obviously, if it's a danger to the individual or a danger to others, then that's going to take more precedent over something like instances of swearing or self-stimulatory behavior or work or task avoidance, okay? So that's how we start to narrow down our field of behaviors and really start to pick apart which ones we want to concentrate on first. Now, it's not to say that those other behaviors that an individual might have, so say, for example, you're working with a child who's been known to throw tantrums, to hit and kick others to gain access to food or toys, but they're also engaging in refusal to engage in self-care activities like bathing or brushing their hair and brushing their teeth. Well, yeah, you know, those are important, and maybe the parent really wants them just to adhere to a routine. Okay, yeah, I hear you. Those things are very important. But first, we need to deal with the biggest behaviors, the biggest barriers to their overall well-being and being a successful individual in life of using functional, real communication to gain access to things that they want, such as eating, drinking, or play items. And then once we reach that goal, and they're no longer a danger to themselves or others, and they're using great communication, then we can start working on the less important or significant things, such as getting them dressed, adhering to a routine of brushing their teeth, eating at the table, all of those sorts of things, okay? So that's how we really identify our first behaviors that we're going to target and work on in isolation. Once we know what that is, we create what's called a behavioral definition. Remember back in our training that we talked about using conceptually systematic language, right? And so our behavior definition should be clear and concise, so that no matter who views the behavior, everyone is measuring it the same way or understands what that behavior is. Okay, so for an example, and I know we've talked about this before, so I'm not going to go into too much depth with it, but if we have an individual who we'll say throws things in the house, there's a difference between targeting the behavior of aggressing towards others by throwing things with the intent to harm versus throwing things within the environment not aimed towards others. Okay, do you see the two definitions there? So one has the intent to harm, and the other one has throwing things in the environment, not necessarily aimed towards others. Those would be more like frustration, like, oh my God, I'm so tired of this, or I don't want to play anymore, and they knock things aside, or yelling and screaming because a puzzle piece doesn't fit and they throw it across the classroom, versus I'm going to pick up my phone and I don't want to do work, and you literally throw it at, you get the phone thrown at you, right? So those are two very different behaviors, but you need to make sure that the behavioral definition of throwing things in the environment is written so clearly with such detailedness that you, when you go to enter the data and you say, yep, at 10:30, check, they threw an object as with the intent to harm towards me, that doesn't actually accidentally get checked off in the category that could be just throwing objects in the environment. So you can see why making sure that your behavioral definition is systematically, conceptually systematic and operationally defined is so important. I have a list online I want you to take a peek at. They're examples of targeted behaviors and operational definitions. It just gives you some very explicit definitions. You're going to laugh as you go through some of these because you're going to be like, oh my goodness, did they really have to go with that depth to define the behavior? But yeah, we really do, okay? Because, for example, if we have refusal, failure to perform academic assignments, this definition says non-compliance in terms of initiating or attempting to focus on and or engage in educational tasks as directed by an instructional personnel. That's actually an okay definition, but I might take it a step further, right? Because some individuals, although they might hem and haw, and they might take a minute, if you give them some space, eventually they're going to comply and initiate in the task. So I would even take that a step further and define it as would engage when presented with a task within 2 minutes, okay? So I gave him a little bit of time, and then after that 2-minute period went by, if they still didn't engage in it, then I would check it off as an instance of non-compliance. But sometimes you have to be very specific about things like that. So take a peek at that online. It'll better help you get an idea of what good operational definitions look like. When we write a behavioral intervention plan, operational definitions will most likely have an example of that definition and a non-example of that definition, just to further clarify to you exactly what's considered that behavior and what isn't considered. You should be really getting the drift that this is an important part of reading a behavioral intervention plan, right? So the one that's going to be online for child A For example, physical aggressions. Anytime, including but not limited to pushing, hitting, grabbing, kicking, headbutting, and pinching with enough force to cause harm to another individual. Okay? So this isn't just like he comes up and just does this. I wouldn't include that. That's not an instance of physical aggression. Okay? And so then the example here is child walks past his mother and uses his hand in a swatting-like motion with enough force to elicit pain from his mother. Non-example. Child walks past his mother and uses his hand in a swatting-like motion and lightly taps her on the arm, not causing bodily harm. Okay, so this would probably be for a pretty significantly aggressive individual, because here our main goal is to really address those aggressive and harming behaviors. So when it comes to what technically is and what technically isn't, best practice, if you have a question, go to the behavioralist or the case manager on that file and say, hey, this happened today. What do I qualify that as? Does it fall under our operational definition or does it not? And then you can assure that you're taking data with validity, okay? Because it's really important for us as behavioralists to go back and look at those data sheets and know that it's accurate and reliable information. But that can only happen if our operational definitions are written well enough and that you as staff are quantifying behaviors to fit exactly those behavioral definitions as what is or isn't considered that target behavior, okay? So that's defining our behavior. Once we define our behavior, then we can start doing our behavioral assessment and further assessing those defined or targeted behaviors. And our primary goal is to figure out exactly what the function of the behavior is. Hence, functional behavioral assessment. Why is it occurring? The beginning of our training, remember we talked a little bit about the different functions of behavior. Okay, we've got gaining access to items, tangibles, gaining access to attention, escape and avoidance from activities, or what we called sensory. Okay, so those are the four primary categories of functions of behaviors. So when we conduct our assessment, everything that we do or we ask a question about is going to be in regards to figuring out which of those four categories this behavior is occurring due to. All right. So there are some ways that we initially start off gaining information to be able to put together our final functional behavioral assessment. Those are grouped into two primary areas. We have indirect and direct behavioral assessments. Indirect behavioral assessments rely on interviewing staff and parents who work with the child, or having them fill out what we call assessment scales, Likert type scales. So I'll give you an example here. This is called the Motivational Assessment Scale, or the MASS. This will be online, and what it does is it asks you questions about the behavior, and then you have to rate them according to 0 never occurs to 6 always occurs. And as you can see at the top, it asks for you a description of the targeted behavior. So our operational definition would go right in here. And the instructions are to identify those situations where an individual is likely to behave in specific ways. From this information, more informed decisions can be made about selections of appropriate replacement behaviors. To complete the MASS, select one behavior of interest, be specific about it. For example, is aggressive, is not good as description as hitting others. And then all of a sudden, quote unquote, out of blue, this individual started hitting somebody next to them, okay? It wasn't necessarily to gain access to anything. It wasn't to get them to go away from them, but it seemed to kind of happen out of the blue. And sometimes that points more towards that sensory category, that there are things happening internally that cause that behavior because the individual isn't doing it to get anything else out of it, okay? So by answering questionnaires like this, we can start our process in really narrowing down why a behavior is occurring. There are other forms similar to this, something called the Functional Assessment Screening Tool, the FAST, and there's obviously a variety of others that are used. But if you'd like more information on them, you can look further into our handout and our PowerPoint online. Okay, so that's one way that we gain information. for those indirect measures, aside from just having basic interview and questionnaires with people who work with the individual or caretakers. The other way is conducting ABC data, okay? There are a variety of ways that we can conduct ABC data. There are some data sheets within this section, and I would like you to refer to those because they'll give you up-close examples of taking ABC data. But the first type of sheet we have is what's called anecdotal data, okay? Anecdotal just means that you're literally writing things down, okay? Anecdotal data is going to be placed in antecedent, behavior, and consequence. So again, going back to our ABCs of behavior that we had at the beginning, what happened immediately before the behavior? What was the behavior? And then what happened after, right? Okay. You guys remember this from before. If you forgot about taking ABC data and what that looks like, I urge you to go back in our training to our first module and review our ABCs again. So we have our anecdotal data. Another way that we can take data is using something like a functional assessment observation form. Okay, so this is a type of scatter plot where we can write the times of the day down here or parts of a day like periods in school. And then as events occur, our targeted behaviors, we can plot them in, okay? This takes a little bit more in-depth training to use. So if this is something that you come across, you can expect to have more training on this data taking piece from your supervisor or the BCBA on the case. Because it does get a little tricky. You can practice it at home. If you're interested in seeing more, I can put an online video that shows exactly how to use the FAOF or Functional Assessment Observation Form for your own knowledge, okay? But for the purposes of this training, we're going to move on. Here's another type of scatterplot data sheet. This one again sets the times of the day as well as the settings, and then we have the dates across here, and you're literally just supposed to check off how many times the targeted behavior of concern occurred during that time on that day. And scatter plots are beneficial because what we can do as behavioral analysts is then look and see, I do see a little bit of a trend. You know, all of these behaviors seem to be occurring in the morning. Maybe during the first activity, right before breakfast. Maybe we should really see if this kiddo is hungry, and that's one of the reasons why they're aggressing before snack is being presented, right? It could be one of the things that we might conclude from here. Or maybe all of a sudden we look at this and behaviors are only occurring during seated work time. So then when we really assess the data, it might show that this individual is engaging in the behavior to escape or avoid work, okay? But you can see why it takes a really well-trained RBT to be able to put in good data so that when we start to really sum our data and take a peek at it, we get valid measures, and it's an accurate reflection or portrayal of the individual's real behavior, what's really occurring, okay? So once that direct data is summed, generally we sum data, we ask it to be taken for a consecutive amount of days, at least 5 days. Can you guess why? The idea is that we all have good and bad days, right? So we've got to kind of take multiple days and take the average of those to really get a better portrayal of what's occurring. Ideally, we would collect data across multiple weeks, but sometimes based on the severity or the need of the case and the behavior, we collect a smaller period of data so that we can put in a plan faster sooner than later. So along with that direct data that you collect as an RBT or the teacher collects and you help support them, the behavioralist on the case is going to take some direct data as well, most likely ABC data. They're going to come in and directly observe the individual, take notes, and record their own data, and then include that in the report. So we're going to just briefly go through the functional behavioral assessment so you can have an idea of what that looks like and how we use that to inform a behavioral intervention plan. So hopefully you have your FBA in front of you. Again, Child A. So on our first page here, we're going to have an overview, gives you some background information about the client, maybe why an FBA was requested, why it's really important and socially significant for this individual we're working with. And then it's going to tell you the sources of data, where we got our numbers from, basically. So here, case and review of record for background knowledge. We interviewed the child's mother and grandmother in regard to behavioral concerns. And then ABC data was taken by the parents as well as the behavioralist, and a functional assessment screening tool was conducted. That's in the form of our interview format there to also assess the data, okay? Then on the second page, it outlines the targeted behaviors concerned. So we have physical aggressions and then obsessive compulsive behaviors that interfere with their ability to complete tasks. These were the two priority behaviors chosen. You can understand why these are incredibly socially significant for this child. Because A, physical aggressions are unsafe for them and to others around them. And then the obsessive compulsive behavior interferes with their ability to participate like a normal person day to day. Okay? This individual, like for example, couldn't go to the bathroom without rocking in and out of the bathroom doorway 20 times. And if for some reason they were interrupted, they would physically aggress to another individual. Or they would have a really hard time walking by things that weren't exactly in place, and they would have to go back and put it just so it was facing the right direction or on a right angle, and if anyone was in their way, they would plow them over. Not on purpose, but just because they were in their way and so intent on getting to that item. So that's why we chose those two targeted behaviors for concern. Then it goes through some relevant background information here, kind of like a regular psychology report would. As well as a contextual analysis. So this contextual analysis is going to be really that direct observation that the behavioralist does, and where they summarize exactly what they saw this individual engaging in. This has a rather long contextual analysis. And then we start to really analyze our data, and we take it apart and we put it into two categories. Antecedent triggers, things that are likely to come right before the behavior, and then consequences. What happens immediately afterwards, or why is the behavior occurring? Okay, so from our antecedent triggers, here we've got, again, our results for physical aggressions and then OCDs. Data showed that there was a total of 11 instances of aggressions. Out of the 11 total instances, 11 or 100% of the instances were preceded by a demand or request of the child. And then for obsessive compulsive behavior, data showed that out of 12 instances, 10 or 84% of them occurred when there was a demand placed on the child. And out of the 12, 1 or 8% was preceded by being denied access to an item. And then the other 1% was when the child was alone. Okay, so there are multiple things occurring right before. So this is helpful because then you can start to think when you're writing a behavioral intervention plan, okay, what things do I need to be wary of? Or maybe what can I alter or change in the environment so this individual is no longer coming in contact with those antecedents or those things that are likely to elicit a behavior. Okay? And then we get into the functions of our behavior. And this is our hypothesis as to why the behavior is occurring. So we've got physical aggressions. Results from data during the direct observation across 2.5 hours showed that there were a total of 2 recorded instances pushing or bulldozing through caretakers. Immediately after bulldozing through caretakers, child was given attention in the form of being told, no, you can't have that right now, and gained access to desired items. That was just one part. Again, it goes into obsessive compulsive behavior, and then it also goes into direct observations from the ABC data that are included in here. But from that statement, we can hypothetically conclude that aggressions are occurring in order to gain access to items, right? And there might be possibly an attention maintained element too, because they're getting attention immediately after they engage in aggression. And so that will be displayed here as well in graphs. So it'll show you functions of the aggressive behavior and functions of the OCD type behavior. Typically, most functional behavioral assessments will include graphs, just because it's a nice addition and component that visually helps you understand the breakdown and likelihood of why a behavior is occurring or what things might elicit a behavior. Okay? All right. Then, of course, there's going to be a behavioral summary that just summarizes everything, the antecedents to the behavior, the things that are likely maintaining it, and why it's occurring over time. And then at the end of our report, we'll have goal recommendations. You know how you guys are contracted for a certain number of hours to work on a case? Typically, it comes from these recommendations. They're based on our thoughts of, all right, how much service does this kiddo really need to be able to reach their goals in decreasing these behaviors? Ideally, that would be enough, but sometimes, we take into consideration other variables as well. What is the school looking for? How many hours are realistic for them? Or if there's financial concerns, how many hours are going to be adequate for this family? Or, if the family is super stressed and has a lot going on, maybe they can only have us in their home for a few hours a day. So even though we would like to provide them with around-the-clock services, they can only handle 3 hours a day, right? So we would say, okay, fine, 3 times 5, 15 hours. 15 hours a week for an ABA therapist or a BT to be in the home, and then maybe 3 hours for a behavioralist to consult per week. So once we have our FBA, we can then write a behavioral intervention plan, okay? Behavioral intervention plans are all going to differ depending on the FBA, or at least they should. There are no cookie-cutter behavioral intervention plans. So the behavioral intervention plan that you have in front of you is a home-based behavioral intervention plan. So what I would ask you to do is take a peek at it. It's a little lengthy, so I hope that you had time to read it beforehand, because I'm not going to go through it word by word, otherwise we would be here all day. But I want to go over some key components, okay? So again, your behavioral intervention plan is going to outline the targeted behaviors. It's going to outline triggers or antecedents to the behavior that were found, as well as outline functions of the behavior or consequences, why it's occurring. Once we go through that part, we then sit down with the parents or staff members at school administration and we say, all right, what are going to be those pivotal behavioral goals that we need to teach or we need to use functional communication training with to replace the behavior with more appropriate behaviors? So again, we're going to prioritize, using a variety of different considerations as we do so, to figure out what's going to be most important first. For this kiddo, as you can see, we've got using a PECS book to communicate using a 2-word phrase, requesting using a break when needed, increased variety of leisure skills. This was put in to hopefully decrease the amount of physical stereotypy and OCD he's having so that we're keeping him busy all the time. Increased social engagement by engaging in leisure activities with another person. This child preferred to spend his day literally rocking or tapping items by himself on the floor or in the corner of a room. So we really wanted to make his life more meaningful, more socially significant, more enjoyable. So we put in some leisure time with him. And then following a daily visual schedule. So using those visual supports to help structure his day, help him comprehend our expectations, and then make it a little bit easier for the family to get him to adhere to those different parts of the schedule. Then we also had some goals for decreasing his aggressions, OCD type behaviors, tantrums, dumping of liquid on the floor, and attempting to gain food or drinks outside of designated meal times. So we had our goals in there, right? These goals are incredibly important because these goals are what the behavioralist or the case manager or teacher is going to use in order to track and monitor their progress over time. Okay? So when you fill out those data sheets at the end of the day, all of those get summed and then are reflected back on these goals. Are we meeting them? Are we not making progress? If we're not making progress, how do we change our intervention so that it is more successful? Okay, so again, that's why it's so important for you to take data. You're going to hear me over and over, data, but that's how we measure and monitor our progress, is reviewing that data. And if our data is incorrect, then our monitoring system is going to be faulty as well. It's what we call procedural integrity. Okay, it's how well our plan is being implemented as designed. You know what? Let's stop there and make a SAFMET for it. So, procedural integrity. How well a procedure is being implemented as designed. Add that to your SAFMET cards. Okay. So again, I can't urge you enough, if you have any questions on your data taking process or the expectations that are had of you as to how you respond to behavior or how you set up the environment in a proactive way to minimize the occurrence of behaviors, please, please, please ask for clarification. Because as you know, little things that are mistaken can add to big issues down the road. So it's much easier to catch them in the now and change things than it is to catch them 3 weeks from now, and then we have 3 weeks of data that we can't use, and we've really lost ground on. So, all right, going forward. So then in your behavioral intervention plan, you should also have proactive strategies. These are strategies that you can do ahead of time to decrease or minimize the possibility of behaviors occurring in the future. This has in it conducting a preference assessment. So remember, we've talked about preference assessments before and how valuable they are in increasing the motivation for an individual. Using a visual schedule, so we talked about that, how important it is to create consistent expectations for an individual and add structure to a routine. Within task schedules is also in here, and reinforcement strategies, so getting them to do those task analyses using a visual, so like steps to brushing their teeth, steps to brushing or using the bathroom, going to bed, waking up in the morning and getting dressed and going to school, eating, all of those things. So you can keep going through, there's a variety of them. Another important one though in here, it should be given a 30-second wait time when provided a direction to increase processing of information. I see this a lot. This is one of those strategies that is just gold. When you're working with individuals with disabilities, give them a direction and then wait. Have some patience. Don't give them a direction, put your shoes on, put your shoes on. Did you hear me? Did you hear me? Put your shoes on. I already asked you. Holy cannoli, right? I'm going to get a headache. Give them the direction, put your shoes on, and then just wait, because some of our kiddos really do need a little bit of processing time. Or maybe they have other things that are going on in their head. So instead, give them the direction, wait a few seconds if they don't respond, maybe give them a light tap on the shoulder or get in their face, make eye contact with them. Hi, put your shoes on, right? You got their attention, they're likely to respond. Because otherwise, you might elicit some negative behaviors. And I honestly don't blame the individuals because I get pretty annoyed too, okay? And then you're always going to have consequence or reinforcement procedures in here. So reinforcement procedures are going to be, again, the same, conducting a preference assessment, and then he has a token economy that's being implemented to encourage him attending to those different parts of his routine and following our directions. And then obviously praise, and then a fading plan so that we create independence and we don't foster dependence on our prompting. Remember, we talked about least to most, and in creating really independence is our ultimate goal. All right. So then on the next page, we have some behavioral responding guidelines, which are also part of a consequence, but they're written out so that the staff member knows exactly what they should do in case these targeted behaviors occur. So number one, aggressive behavior. Here it says, tell child in a stern tone, stop. Remove yourself to a safe vicinity if possible. Check immediate surroundings to make sure that all family members are safe. Ask the child to functionally communicate his wants or needs. A visual choice board should be present to show the child to point to the desired item. So you would literally stop, check the surroundings, get his choice board, and say something like, what do you want? Right? And then you help him touch exactly what it is that he's trying to communicate. Maybe he wants food or he wants drink. Okay, well, don't plow me over. Use your words, and then I'll get it for you. Right? And so you immediately then give him access to that item once he communicates with you. But if for some reason it's not available, and then it lists that here, if an activity or item is not currently available that he wants, you should also arrange his visual schedule to help the child understand what the current expectation is and when he can have access to that thing. So then I might bring up his to-do and done schedule and say, look, okay, right now we need to do our chore, and then you can have access to a snack. Chore first, then snack. So he has that visual, concrete comprehension tool right there to help him understand. Because, right, he may think that, oh my God, I'm never going to be able to eat. I'm never going to be able to have a drink. But if you show him, look, no, you just got to do this first, and then we can have that, then he's going to learn, okay, it is coming. It's not never available. I just have to do this one thing first, and then I can have access to it. And if we are 100% consistent with that system, then he will start to have faith in us, right? And know that we too will follow through, okay? But it's incredibly important. Consistency is key. And again, it's not just our job to implement this procedure, but it's our job to help support the other individuals that are working with him. And if it's at home, supporting the family to follow through, because ultimately our goal is to be able to draw back and leave the family with the learning tools and knowledge to be able to implement this plan when we're not around. And then it also shows you what happens if this student continues to get agitated. Direct the child, tell them to take space in a break area, and then use planned ignoring strategies. Say, oh, okay, you know what? I see you're not ready to talk about this right now. Why don't you take some space, calm down, and I'll check back in with you in a minute. And then you literally walk out of the room. Give them about a minute or two, maybe a little bit more. If it's a child who takes some time to really regulate themselves, check back in. Hey, what is it that you wanted? Did you still want juice? Okay, well, let's go do our chore, or let's just take the trash out of the trash bin, and then we can have some juice, right? So maybe you lessen the expectations so they don't have to do the whole thing, but just one piece of it, so at least they comply, and then you can gain access to the preferred item, okay? And that's also a really key and integral part to programming and being able to respond to behaviors, is that if something pops up, lessen demands. Everybody has an off day, okay? But the most important part is that they at least comply to some minimal form of the original direction or question asked of them, and then they can have the world. You can throw them a party, but at least don't let them get away with it, because then you literally teach them that behavior gets them out of doing things or gets them things that they want. But if at least they have to comply to some form, then they'll learn, yep, all right, I just have to do this one thing and then I can have that, okay? All right. So it goes on to list out a variety of other strategies you can use in order to respond to behaviors. Again, these are all going to be different considering where you're going to be location-wise and who your behavioralist is and what the family want too, because some families might not want you to be hands-on, so it's going to be a lot of walking away, giving them space and time. Other families might say, you know what, it's okay for you to use a physical restraint in the home environment because the behavior is severe enough that it warrants the use of that and it is a safety concern. But if there are, again, any questions, you need to make sure that you check in with someone and clarify what it is that you have a question about. And then on the last page is going to tell you progress measurement procedures. This says ABC, frequency and duration data will be recorded to evaluate child's behavior. So again, it goes back to data. Why is it so important? Because we use the data to continually monitor progress, okay? So make sure, again, any questions with things that you ask. I'm going to briefly go over the data sheets we have in place for this kiddo. I have a daily targeted behavior data sheet. Again, you can find this in your file folder online. So here my expectation is read the behavior definitions below. Each day record the frequency of each behavior exhibited. Okay, so I would ask probably the parents and the therapist to record this at home. So it's, remember we talked about continuous data, okay, or continuous interval. So I'm asking them across the day, how many tantrums did they have total? How many aggressions did they have total on Monday? How many OCDs, dumping, and attempts to gain food? Okay, so I should see a number in there or a tally mark for each day. And then I can come at the end of the week and I can count up all of those and I can say, okay, well, on week 1, we had an average of 15 instances of tantrums per day. But on week 6 of our intervention, we were down to 2. So we're making progress, all right? So, and that would be considered what kind of data sheet? Frequency data sheet, good. Okay, and continuous, not discontinuous measuring operation. Then we also have a more complex data sheet that we're taking here. Since language is so important for us to decrease this child's interfering behaviors, because we want to teach him to use language instead of aggressing or things, I have a session data sheet that is specifically asking the therapist to keep track of communication. And that's why they're supposed to tally each time they use a sentence strip, they use a one-word phrase, they use their choice board to communicate, or they communicate needing a break. Because my hope is that all of those increase, okay? But I'm giving this child a variety of different tools. Sometimes you're not going to see all of those tools on one sheet, but since this was a new case and he's had minimal experience with communication training, I wanted to put in everything to see what was going to be most useful in encouraging language development. Okay, and then I also have a duration and frequency activity engagement tracking sheet. This kiddo literally would sit all day on the floor tapping things. Tapping things on himself, tapping things on the floor, on furniture, on the TV, on his grandmother, okay? So we needed to teach him some leisure skills, some things that would give him enjoyment out of life other than just tapping. But again, new guys. So I asked our therapist to approach him with a variety of activities. We brought an activity bin to the house, and she was supposed to take one out one at a time, you know, approach him with it, try to get him to engage, and then record the number of minutes that she got him to use that activity, if he communicated if he wanted more or if he didn't at all, and then the effect on him. Was he interested in it? Did he lose interest, or did it get him overly excited? Maybe it was like too much sensory stuff for him, okay? So this was a nice tracking sheet for us to use to gain some initial information to inform our interventions going forward and what activities or leisure skills we might be able to teach him further based on his self-interest. Again, because remember, he's going to be more motivated to engage with these materials if they're valuable to him. Okay? All right, so those are some examples of, that's an example of a behavioral intervention plan and the data sheets that go along with it for this FBA. I'm going to include another example of a BIP and FBA online for a school-based case. So please make sure that you review that as well, because it'll just give you a different viewpoint. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask.